I had the whole evening planned around this moment.
What is this?
Open it. That's all I'm asking you to do.
Are you sure you want to do this in front of everyone?
To health, happiness, and enduring success. Cheers.
I've never been more certain.
She said it like a closing statement. My wife stood in front of nearly 70 people and declared she had never been more certain of anything in her life. What she couldn't know was that her certainty was built on a version of me she had stopped paying attention to years ago. I hadn't spent the last 8 months falling apart quietly. I had spent them preparing for exactly this night. And as she raised that glass toward a room full of people already laughing, the only question worth asking was how much they had missed while they were busy looking down. If you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, this story is going to hit differently. Subscribe and stay with this channel. We tell the stories that actually matter. I want to tell you something before any of this makes sense. The night Shannon handed me those papers wasn't the night my marriage ended. The marriage had already been over for a long time, I just hadn't said it out loud yet. What happened at the Ember Room was more like a door slamming shut on a house that had already been empty for years. And the only reason it landed the way it did, the only reason I was able to sit in that chair and sign my name without flinching, was because I had spent the better part of 8 months building toward exactly that moment quietly, carefully, and completely alone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Shannon and I met when we were both still figuring out who we were going to become. She was working events on weekends to help cover expenses while she built her reputation. I was 3 years into a job that kept me outdoors in all weather, learning the structural side of commercial construction from people who didn't have patience for mistakes. We weren't glamorous. We were 2 people who worked hard, paid our bills, and thought that was enough to build something real on. For a while, I think it was. We bought a house in Boise. We made plans. She grew the business alongside her mother and her sister, and I moved up into project supervision at Timberline Structural Works. The life we had wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I was proud of it. The problem was that Shannon's family had a very different definition of what a life worth having was supposed to look like. Whitcomb's Signature Events had spent years cultivating a client base of people who measured their own worth in catering budgets and venue square footage. Geraldine Shannon's mother had built the whole operation on the idea that proximity to wealth was the same thing as having it. She could tell you within 30 seconds of meeting someone whether they were worth her time, and she made that calculation entirely based on what she could see: your title, your car, your watch, the name of the firm you worked for. I never checked any of those boxes. I showed up to family dinners in clean clothes that still somehow read as work clothes to her. I drove a truck. I didn't talk about deals or portfolios. And in Geraldine's mind, that made me a problem Shannon had accumulated rather than a person she had chosen. April, Shannon's younger sister, had married Colby Madden, a man who described himself as an entrepreneur and spent most of his energy making sure everyone at the table knew it. Colby liked to talk. He would spend an entire dinner outlining a new venture while somehow implying that the rest of us were standing still. The jokes about my job started small, a comment here, a raised eyebrow there, but over the years they settled into something more routine. He'd ask when I was planning to get off the job site like it was a starter position I'd forgotten to leave. April would laugh in a way that made it clear she thought the question was fair. The part that wore on me wasn't Colby. Men like Colby aren't hard to read, and I'd learned a long time ago not to spend energy on people who needed to shrink others to feel large. What wore on me was watching Shannon across those dinner tables. There were years when she would deflect those comments, change the subject, redirect the room. But at some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when that stopped. The redirecting became silence. The silence became a small smile. And eventually, the smile became something that looked from where I was sitting a lot like agreement. That was the thing I could never quite shake. Not the jokes. Not Geraldine's barely concealed disappointment. What I couldn't shake was the moment I'd glance over at my wife and realize she wasn't on my side of the room anymore. I told myself it was stress. The business was growing faster than any of them had prepared for, and Geraldine ran it like a general who trusted no one's instincts but her own. Shannon was under pressure. I wasn't always able to see clearly from the outside. I made excuses the way you do when you're not ready to look at something directly. And for a while, those excuses were enough to keep me from asking the questions I should have been asking. Then came the afternoon. Everything shifted. It was a Thursday about 8 months before my birthday. I'd finished a site inspection earlier than expected and was cutting back through downtown Boise when I spotted Shannon's car parked outside a boutique hotel near the center of the city. Something made me slow down instead of pulling past some instinct that I had learned to trust over years of reading job sites, of knowing when a structure that looked solid was carrying a problem underneath. I pulled into a space across the street and sat there for a few minutes. Then Shannon came out through the lobby doors, and she wasn't alone. She was with Seth Halbrook, a developer I had heard mentioned a handful of times in the context of the Whitcomb business, someone who ran boutique hotel projects and had crossed paths with the family through event partnerships. He put his hand on the small of her back, and she leaned into it, and then they said something to each other, and he kissed her, unhurried like it was something they had done many times before. I didn't get out of the truck. I didn't call her name. I sat in that parking space and watched until they went their separate ways, and then I drove home and thought about what I had just seen for the rest of the afternoon. That night, Shannon came home and told me the client meeting had run long. I looked at her and asked if everything had gone well. She looked straight back at me and said it had gone very well. Her expression didn't change. Her voice didn't change. Nothing in her face shifted at all while she said it. And that was the moment I understood that whatever problem existed in our marriage was much deeper than I had allowed myself to believe. This wasn't someone wrestling with a mistake. This was someone who had been living a separate life long enough that the lying had become automatic. I want to be honest about what I felt in the days that followed because I think it matters. I was not calm. I was not strategic. I sat with what I had seen for several days before I could think clearly. And in that space there was grief and anger and something that felt like embarrassment, though I couldn't have said what exactly I was embarrassed about. I hadn't done anything wrong. But when you realize the person you've been building a life with has been somewhere else entirely, there's a particular kind of humiliation that doesn't care about logic. It just sits there until you're ready to work through it. What I didn't do was confront her. And that was a deliberate choice. I had thought about it, had run the scene in my head 100 times, walking into a room and putting everything on the table. But every time I played it through, I kept arriving at the same problem. If I confronted Shannon in that moment in anger without anything in order, she would know exactly what I had seen, and she would start closing doors. Whatever could be accessed, documented, or understood about our financial life together would start moving. I had heard enough from people who had been through difficult divorces to know how fast things could change when one party decided the other was no longer a partner, but an opponent. So instead of walking into that conversation, I walked into my attorney's office. What followed was 8 months of the most methodical work I had ever done. I documented what I had witnessed. I reviewed every account I had access to, tracked what was moving and what wasn't, and made sure I understood exactly what our shared financial picture looked like before anyone had a reason to change it. I pulled together records I hadn't looked at in years, made copies of everything that mattered, and stored them somewhere Shannon had no reason to go. Through all of it, I kept showing up to work, to dinners, to the ordinary rhythms of a marriage that was already over, because the most important thing was that no one in that house knew what I was doing. It was during those 8 months that I also took a complete accounting of Sagecrest property holdings, which was something I had built so gradually over the preceding decade that it had never required much visible attention. I had started buying small properties in the early years of our marriage, a duplex here, a unit there, always in areas I knew were undervalued because my work took me to parts of the city that developers hadn't found yet. I renovated what I could with my own hands and my own knowledge, refinanced carefully when the numbers made sense, and added a small commercial warehouse to the portfolio a few years in. None of it happened fast. None of it was dramatic. It was just the result of knowing what I knew and applying it consistently over a long period of time, the kind of work that doesn't look like anything until you step back and see the whole shape of it. The portfolio was currently valued at just over $3 million, every asset documented, every ownership structure clean, and none of it mixed with marital funds in any way that would complicate what belonged to me. Shannon had been asking questions in the weeks before my birthday. Not obvious ones, but the kind you ask when you're trying to map something without appearing to map it. She would bring up my retirement accounts in passing, ask about the value of the house in a roundabout way, mention investment property in a tone meant to sound curious rather than purposeful. I listened to every question and answered none of them completely because by then I understood exactly what was coming. I just didn't know she had chosen my birthday to do it. The Ember Room was Shannon's choice of venue. She had selected it months in advance, told me it was because she wanted my 39th birthday to be something memorable, something worthy of the occasion. I had taken that at face value because I was still performing the role of a man who didn't know what was coming. The restaurant sat high enough above downtown Boise that on a clear night you could see the city spread out in every direction, and the private dining room she had reserved held nearly 70 guests without feeling crowded. It was an impressive room. Shannon had always known how to choose a room. I got there early. Old habit from the job, if you show up after the work has already started, you've already lost something. I stood near the entrance and watched the space fill up, noticing things the way I had trained myself to notice things over the past 8 months. Geraldine arrived and went straight to the table closest to the front, the one with the best sightline to the center of the room. She wasn't dressed for a birthday dinner. She was dressed for an occasion she had decided in advance was going to be significant. April came in with Colby about 20 minutes later, and April had her phone in her hand before she had even taken off her coat. Colby was smiling in the particular way he smiled when he thought he was about to be entertained. Shannon arrived last, which was unlike her. She was usually precise about timing, but she came in about 10 minutes after the room had filled, moving through the space with the easy warmth. She had always been good at making her way toward me with the energy of someone who had a script already running in her head. She kissed me on the cheek and told me I looked good. I thanked her. We sat down together and the dinner began, and for about an hour and a half it looked like a birthday party. What I understood by then was that Shannon wasn't just ending the marriage. She and her mother had built a strategy around it, and the strategy depended on a version of my financial life that was significantly simpler than the reality. They believed I was a man with a salary, some savings, and a house we jointly owned because people who decide in advance what someone is worth rarely go back to check their assumptions. The dinner, I had come to understand, was meant to remove any opportunity I might have to get ahead of the narrative. If Shannon served me papers in front of 70 people on my birthday, the story wrote itself, and I would spend the next several weeks reacting instead of acting. It was a reasonable plan. It just didn't account for the fact that I had been acting for 8 months already. Shannon stood up about 10 minutes before the cake was supposed to come out. The room quieted in the way rooms do when someone with presence commands attention, and she stood there for a moment with the ease of someone who had rehearsed what came next. She said she had a surprise for me, said it with a smile, then reached into the bag beside her chair and set a sealed envelope on the table directly in front of me. The way she stepped back told me she expected what happened next to unfold in a very specific direction. Geraldine's smile appeared immediately from the front table, the smile of someone who had helped plan the moment and was now watching it execute. April raised her phone and began recording. Colby said something loud enough for the nearest tables about the working man finally getting a real surprise, and a few people laughed, uncertain whether they were watching a performance or something else entirely. I picked up the envelope, opened it, and read the first line of the document inside. I already knew what it was going to say, but I read it anyway because reading things carefully before responding is something I had learned to do a long time ago. Then I took the pen from my jacket pocket. I had put it there that morning and signed my name at the bottom of the first page. The room was quiet enough that the sound of the pen crossing the paper was almost audible. I slid the envelope back across the table toward Shannon and looked at her directly. "Are you sure you want to do this in front of everyone?" I asked. She lifted her chin and said she had never been more certain of anything in her life. "Good," I said, and I turned and nodded to the restaurant manager who was standing near the back wall and had been waiting for exactly that signal. The screen on the far wall of the room came to life. What appeared on it was not a slideshow of birthday memories, not a tribute or a montage or anything that could have been mistaken for a celebration. It was a timeline, 8 months of documented events organized chronologically presented without commentary, one entry at a time. The first entry was a date and a location, the boutique hotel in downtown Boise. Below the date was a photograph taken from across the street. Below the photograph was a name, Seth Halbrook. The timeline moved forward slowly. Other dates, other cities, matching dates. Shannon had told me she was at client meetings, receipts with his name attached, GPS records from her phone, placing her somewhere other than where she said she was. Each entry was clean, factual, and sourced. I had not dramatized any of it. I had simply documented what was true. Seth was in the room that night, standing near the back with the expression of someone watching a wall fall toward him. Shannon had gone completely still. Geraldine was the first to find her voice. She said something about privacy, about decency, about what kind of man does something like this. She used the word obsessive. She used the word unstable. She framed me as a paranoid man who had surveilled his wife and was now humiliating her publicly as an act of spite. I let her finish. Then I nodded toward the screen where Dean Hollowell, my financial advisor of nearly a decade, appeared through a video call that had been connected and waiting. Dean was not a dramatic man. He spoke the way people speak when they know the facts are already interesting enough on their own. He confirmed what Sagecrest Property Holdings currently held, outlined the careful structure that had kept every asset clearly in my name, and noted that the portfolio was valued at just over $3 million with documentation that left nothing ambiguous. He said all of this in about 4 minutes, and then the call ended. Colby was no longer smiling. Geraldine had the look of someone rapidly recalculating something they thought they had already solved. The expression of a person who had spent 11 years looking at a man and seeing only what they expected to see and was only now registering the cost of that mistake. The room was very quiet, and in that quiet, I felt not triumph, but something closer to exhaustion, the particular kind that comes at the end of a very long effort when the thing you have been carrying finally reaches its destination, and you understand how heavy it actually was. The weeks that followed were ugly in the way endings always are when nobody involved is ready to be honest about their part in them. Shannon's first response was anger, not the wounded kind, but the tactical kind, moving quickly toward narrative control. April posted things on social media that painted me as controlling and paranoid without naming me directly. Colby made statements about what would happen in court that were designed to sound threatening without containing any specific legal substance. I didn't respond publicly. I had a lawyer and I let him handle the correspondence. What I focused on was the financial review already underway, because something had surfaced during the documentation process that was separate from the affair and significantly more serious. 2 years before that birthday dinner, Whitcomb's Signature Events had gone through a difficult stretch, a period when the operating accounts were strained to the point of crisis. A business loan had been secured during that time, and the loan had kept the company functional. What I had not known, what I discovered only when my attorney began pulling documents, was that my name appeared in the loan file as a guarantor. I had never agreed to guarantee that loan. I had never signed any document authorizing it. The explanation was straightforward, and that made it worse. Someone had located a document containing my actual signature, scanned it, and reproduced it on the guarantee form. Beyond that, one of the Sagecrest properties had been listed in the supporting materials as a source of collateral. My property used to back someone else's debt, without my awareness or permission. It was the kind of arrangement that works when nobody is paying attention, when the person whose name is being used is assumed to be too uninvolved to ever notice. The assumption, as it turned out, was wrong. When my attorney submitted the relevant documents to the lender with a formal inquiry, the loan was placed under review and the business accounts flagged for examination. A major event contract that Whitcomb's Signature Events had been finalizing was suspended pending resolution of the company's legal standing. Seth Halbrook withdrew from the hotel development project he and Shannon had been planning and retained his own attorney within 72 hours. Shannon called him. He didn't answer, and that silence told her everything she needed to know about what his presence in her life had actually been worth. The paper trail that followed was thorough. Emails emerged showing that Geraldine had pushed to close the loan quickly to avoid losing a contract, that Colby had located the file containing my old signature and forwarded it to the loan processor, and that Shannon had known the guarantee document existed without ever telling me. None of them had thought I would look. That was the part that stayed with me longer than anything else. Not the anger, not the legal exposure, not even the betrayal of having my name used without my knowledge. What stayed with me was the simplicity of the assumption behind all of it. They had looked at a man who wore work boots and managed construction sites and decided that was the full picture. They had never considered that the same discipline it takes to build a $3 million portfolio in 10 years is exactly the discipline it takes to notice when something in the paperwork doesn't add up. Shannon had come to the Ember Room believing she was closing a door on a life she had outgrown. What she had actually done was open every file cabinet in the room. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a collapse. Not the silence of a room where nothing is happening, but the silence of a room where too much has already happened, and nobody knows yet how to speak about it. That was what the weeks after the Ember Room felt like. Shannon had expected the evening to end with her in control of the story. Instead, it had ended with every document my attorney needed already in motion and a loan file drawing the kind of institutional attention that no one in the Whitcomb family had planned for. I had moved into a short-term rental on the east side of Boise shortly after the dinner. It was a plain house, 2 bedrooms, a small yard, nothing that announced itself. I had chosen it deliberately. After 11 years of a home decorated to impress people, Shannon wanted to impress. I wanted something that was simply functional. I wanted to come home after a job site and not feel like I was performing a role. The rental was quiet in the evening, and I found I didn't mind the quiet the way I thought I might. I cooked simple meals, went to bed at reasonable hours, and let my attorney handle the correspondence that kept arriving from Shannon's side of the proceedings. Shannon had moved through anger quickly, which surprised me less than it should have. Anger requires a stable position to stand on, and her position had become less stable with every document that surfaced in the loan review. The social media activity from April slowed and then stopped entirely. Colby's statements about what would happen in court became less specific and then disappeared. Geraldine had gone unusually quiet in a way that told me the family's attorney had advised her to stop talking, the first genuinely sensible decision anyone on that side had made in months. The lender's review moved faster than any of them had anticipated. When a guarantee signature is formally contested and the named guarantor denies authorization in writing, the institutional machinery that follows is not slow. Accounts are flagged. Auditors are engaged. The large event contract that Whitcomb Signature Events had been on the verge of closing was suspended pending resolution of the company's legal status. A second client, hearing something through the industry network that Boise's event world runs on, quietly moved their booking elsewhere. Seth Halbrook had made his calculation at the first sign of institutional risk, and the version of Shannon's future that had been built around his continued presence evaporated in the space of about a week. I knew most of this through my own attorney, who kept me informed as a matter of professional practice. I didn't look for the information, and I didn't take satisfaction in receiving it. What I felt when I heard each update was something closer to tired clarity. The recognition that events were unfolding according to the logic of choices made, which was all they ever did, and that none of what was happening to the Whitcomb family was something I had caused. I had caused none of it. I had only refused to absorb it quietly, which was a different thing entirely. It was a Tuesday evening about 2 weeks after the birthday dinner when I pulled into the driveway of the rental and saw 4 cars parked along the street in front of the house. I recognized all of them immediately. I sat in my truck for a moment, looked at the cars, then got out and walked toward the front door. Geraldine was standing closest to the entrance. That alone told me something, because in 11 years she had never stood at a door waiting for me. She was a woman who positioned herself at the center of rooms, not at thresholds. The fact that she was standing there in the cooling evening air on a street in a neighborhood she would not ordinarily have driven through voluntarily said more about the current state of things than anything she was going to say out loud. April was beside her phone, nowhere in sight. Colby stood slightly behind them, both his shoulders carrying none of the expansive confidence he usually performed. Shannon was the farthest back, standing near the edge of the property, not looking at me directly. I stopped in front of Geraldine and waited. She began the way people like her usually begin when they need something from someone they've spent years underestimating, with a tone still trying to be authoritative, framing the conversation as though she were presenting me with an opportunity rather than asking for help. She talked about the business, the client relationships built over decades, the people who depended on Whitcomb's signature events for their livelihoods. It was well constructed. It acknowledged the situation without acknowledging any responsibility for it. I let her finish. Then I asked whether she was making a request or asking for help. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that contains a whole internal argument, and then said she was asking for help. Not loudly, not with the authority she usually brought to every sentence. Just said it plainly in a voice that sounded like it had traveled a long way to get there. And in that moment I understood something I hadn't quite been able to articulate before. This was the woman who had decided within 30 seconds of meeting me that I wasn't worth her time, and she was standing at my door asking me to save her company. Not because she had changed her mind about who I was, but because she had finally been forced to reckon with what I had actually built. April stood with her arms crossed in a way that looked less defensive than lost, like someone who had shown up because not showing up felt worse, and had nothing prepared beyond that. At some point her eyes filled and she looked away, and I let that be what it was. Colby spoke without being asked to. He said in a flat and careful voice that he had been the one to locate the document containing my old signature and forward it to the loan processor. He did not dress it up or call it a misunderstanding. He said it directly and then stopped talking, which was the first honest thing I had heard from him in years. Shannon was the last one to speak. She walked a few steps closer and said my name, and then said the two words that the whole evening had been building toward. She asked me, please. No argument attached to it, no strategy underneath it. Just the word and the weight of everything that had led to the moment it was spoken. I told them clearly so that everyone present understood it the same way. I would not provide any statement that altered or contradicted what had been submitted to the lender. I would not sign any document designed to reframe my involvement in the loan. I would not accept responsibility for debts I had not authorized. Those were not negotiable, and they were not going to change. But I also told them what I would do. I would not pursue every legal avenue available simply to maximize their exposure. I would instruct my attorney to engage in good faith civil negotiation on the disputed portions of the loan matter, provided that all relevant documents were disclosed without further delay, that no one continued to use my name or my assets in any capacity without written authorization, and that the public statements, the posts, the implications, the campaign. April had briefly stopped permanently. I was not offering them a rescue. I was offering them a defined path through something that was going to be difficult regardless, because destroying people who were already falling was not something I was interested in becoming. Shannon asked whether there was any possibility of saving what we had. I looked at her for a long time before I answered. I thought about the Thursday afternoon in that parking lot. I thought about the evening she came home and told me the meeting had gone well while looking directly into my eyes. I thought about all the dinners I had sat through watching her decide that the people who laughed at me deserved more of her loyalty than I did. I started losing you long before you handed me those papers, I told her. The birthday was just the day I stopped pretending you were still there. She didn't answer. There wasn't anything to answer. It was simply true, and we both knew it, and the knowing of it was its own kind of ending, quieter than the one she had staged at the Ember Room and more final. The divorce was completed several months later. Whitcomb's signature events did not close, but it contracted significantly. Geraldine stepped back from operational leadership, presented publicly as a planned transition, understood privately as the consequence of a situation she had helped create. Colby's legal exposure from the loan matter required its own resolution, which took time and cost money, and left him with considerably less appetite for the table talk he had previously enjoyed. April withdrew from the version of her life she had been performing online for long enough that when she eventually returned to it, most of the audience she had curated was gone. Shannon began again at a smaller scale, fewer clients, smaller events, a version of the business built on what she could actually sustain. Seth Halbrook did not reappear in her life in any meaningful way. He had made his calculation at the first sign of risk, and that calculation told you everything you needed to know about what his presence had actually been worth. I bought a house on the quieter edge of Boise, not a statement, not designed to prove anything to anyone. It had a garage large enough to work in, which was what I had asked for. I kept showing up to the job sites. I kept wearing the same boots. The work didn't change, and I didn't need it to. What had changed was something quieter than what I owned or where I lived. It was the absence of a particular weight I hadn't fully recognized I was carrying until it was gone. The weight of sitting at tables where people had already decided what you were worth and spending your energy trying to exist comfortably in the space between their verdict and the truth. I didn't sit at those tables anymore, and I didn't miss them. I started spending time with the younger crew members at Timberline, talking to them about managing money, building credit, how to buy a first property, how to think about the long term when the short term feels like everything, and particularly about what to do when the people around you decide based on your job title or your truck or your boots that you've already reached the ceiling of what you're capable of. I told them, keep your head down, keep your records clean, and never let someone else's estimate of your value become the number you work from. There was a younger guy on one of my crews that fall early 20s. Good instincts, paying attention to the right things. We were talking one afternoon after the rest of the crew had cleared out, and he asked me something directly the way young people sometimes do when they've decided you're someone worth asking a real question. He had heard enough of the story by then, the way stories travel through work crews, and he wanted to know whether I had felt good when the Whitcomb family came to my door asking for help. I thought about it honestly before I answered. For a few minutes, I told him. And then I realized something. If my sense of having won depended on watching them lose, then they still had control over how I felt. And that's not winning. That's just a different way of letting someone else set the terms. He thought about that for a moment, then nodded slowly. The real victory wasn't the night at the Ember Room, and it wasn't the evening they stood outside my door. It wasn't the timeline on the screen or the portfolio valuation or any of the moments that had felt in the middle of them like the point of the whole thing. The real victory was simpler and less visible than any of that. It was the morning I woke up in a house that was mine with work I was proud of waiting for me, and the complete and total absence of any need for the people who had spent years deciding I wasn't enough to finally look up and see what was actually there. They never did really, and it turned out I didn't need them to. If this story stayed with you, it's probably because you've seen someone be underestimated or you've lived it yourself. The truth is, the quietest people in the room are often the ones who've done the most work when nobody was watching. If that resonates with you, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories about dignity, about patience, and about what it actually means to win. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it today, and we'll see you in the next story.